The anti-nuclear movement was born out of a pretty ugly period in U.S. history in particular that centered around fears of a population explosion, especially in Asia, and how too many humans on the planet might put significant stress on the resources available to us in the West in particular. And that sort of Malthusian instinct flowed actually pretty directly from some ugly eugenicist movements as well in the late 50s. That hardcore group of anti-nuclear environmental activists still funds a fair bit of the high-profile environmental movement today, which, of course, in our view, explains why Greenpeace, for example, is so stubbornly anti-nuclear. The environmental movement has opposed nuclear power precisely because it is a source of safe, carbon-free energy abundance for all humans, which is, of course, their nightmare scenario. They don't want many humans on the planet. They view humans as the cancer on nature, and any damage that we do to nature whatsoever is unacceptable. I think people are beginning to realize what the trade is on offer. The trade is cheap, plentiful, carbon-free power while reducing our carbon footprint with practically little or no changes to our standard of living. That's on one side of the trade. And the other side of the trade is a radical degrowth movement that would lead to mass starvation, economic contraction, and radical decreases in our standards of living. And when given the choice, no human is going to vote for that, or very few humans are going to vote for that, certainly none that aren't suicidal. And as people sort of work their way through all of the poor solutions to our global carbon footprint dilemma, it follows from physics that they necessarily end that nuclear power. And we're seeing that in most countries in the world except for Germany. We wrote a piece called Green is the New Red, which chronicled this crazy degrowth summit that was hosted in the European Parliament itself. And President of the European Union was there at the opening plenary lecture. And the panels were, I mean, it would seem foreign to us that serious people would spend, 18 hours of video on such panels, but like what the first one, Which Prosperous Future Confronting Narratives of Growth. Another one is how do we pay for welfare if we're not going to be growing anymore? They take it as an axiom that degrowth and economic contraction is a wonderful thing to be pursued. And so I think the German people have been bamboozled into policies that will all but certainly lead to significant deindustrialization. And we are already beginning to see significant backlash even within Germany. There is what the media would describe as a far-right party, Alternative for Germany, or AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. And they recently shocked the German political establishment by winning 53% of the vote cast in what we would call sort of a county election. And the media has been framing this as, quote, a danger for democracy. And as we said in a piece that we wrote last week called Tour de Farce, how can voting in election be considered anti-democratic? And the media has portrayed this as this upstart populist party as merely feeding off the populace's, quote, economic insecurity and existential angst, as though these feelings just immaculately appeared. This is a natural and quite predictable, we've predicted it, backlash to the degrowth agenda. And so, as we warned in that piece, the progressive left risks losing its grip on power, not just in Germany, but across the West, if they continue to insist upon degrading the populace's standard of living in the name of climate change. I'm sure you know of Oliver Stone's recent contribution in the pro-nuclear category. I do think what we're seeing now in real time is rather historic. We're seeing in Canada, for example, and in Ontario in particular, a complete renaissance with nuclear power, refurbishing old reactors and pledging to build new ones, including small modular reactors. Similarly, in the U.S., the Biden administration, to its credit, has worked with Governor Newsom in California to try to save and extend the life of Diablo Canyon. We just had, after a long series of delays, a new reactor is going critical in Georgia. The aforementioned small modular reactor industrial project that Dow and X-Energy are pressing forward is very, very interesting to us. Japan, of course, is re-engaging with nuclear and developing a, soup to nuts internal supply chain so that it could secure its own energy future, knowing full well that as an island nation without fossil fuels, nuclear power really is the main choice available to them. Sweden, famously, has walked away from its renewable energy goals and instead will focus on nuclear power, much to the chagrin of the German Green movement. France, of course, is trying to lead within Europe a renaissance towards nuclear power, and by defining nuclear power as green, much to the outrage of Greenpeace, which is why I was quoting from that French journalist a bit earlier. And so almost everywhere you look, even Belgium is making a bit of a return. The Middle East, oil producers are heading into nuclear in a big way. The United Arab Emirates has really executed a fantastic job. I think their third of 4 nuclear reactors have just come online, and they have set up their citizens for generations of clean, stable baseload power. India, of course, and China, everywhere you look in the world, except for Germany, we are seeing that people have done the math. They have decided that the standard of living of their populations are worth pursuing. And many of them, thankfully, are going towards nuclear. Now, it's not all perfect. Germany's blunders and Western Europe's blunders overall has led much of the developing world to return to coal because the attributes of coal that make it particularly useful still exist. And we have burned more coal in 2022 than we ever have before. And we look set to produce a new record in 2023 and beyond. We wrote about this in a piece called The Streisand Effect, where the path function of the environmental progressive left has kind of had the opposite of the intended effect. And the energy crisis of 2022 has rebounded and has caused the world to refamiliarize itself with the benefits of coal. And so if you ask me to choose between baseload power, I would take nuclear every time. I understand why people have returned to coal. That too is predictable. But I do think in the long run, the intermittency and the challenges that wind and solar bring to pre-existing grids will be their downfall. And nuclear will be sort of the last technology standing in our race to reduce our carbon emissions. SMR technology, SMR of course stands for small modular reactors. It's not the SMR nature of the reactors that makes them interesting from an industrial perspective. It is the fact that they are fourth and in some cases fifth generation nuclear reactor designs, which allow for the co-production of electricity and reasonably good grade industrial steam. You know, the type of steam that can be produced from Gen 4 type reactors doesn't solve all of our industrial steam needs, but it does shave a fair bit off of the bottom of the pyramid. And interestingly, the production of industrial steam, we laid all this out in a piece called Gaining Steam, which we published in early May. The production of industrial steam today accounts for more carbon emissions than our entire transportation sector, both automotive and aviation, which is pretty amazing. In fact, I think it's 25% more than the sum of those two combined. And there's very precious little talk about what we should do about that. And there's far more focus on, electric vehicles, for example. While obviously wind and solar can't really help all that much in the production of industrial grade steam, these fourth generation nuclear reactors certainly can. And the reason why SMR is advantageous in this regard is that you could create, small reactors that are easily housed within pre-existing brownfield site, i.e. integrated petrochemical production facilities and so on that are already well secured and guarded. The radius of concern around an SMR is much, much smaller than a traditional large modular reactors that we see in production today. And so they can be easily handled within the fence line of pre-existing industrial facilities. And they represent a pretty much, ready to go technology to abate a significant slug of humanity's carbon emissions. And so that's why we profiled the project between Dow and X-Energy, which again, to Biden's credit, is being heavily supported and subsidized by the Department of Energy because this is a sort of first of its kind type project. And kudos to both companies for having the courage to stand up to the environmental lobby and to side with physics and to address that slug of their carbon emissions head on. And so it is a fascinating time. And for that reason, most people don't realize that like natural gas burned for industrial purposes is very often done in what are known as cogeneration facilities, where both steam and electricity are produced and then used directly on site. And so this is a sort of a drop-in replacement for much of that technology. Again, not perfect. There's a certain temperature range that fourth generation nuclear reactors cannot obtain. And for those industrial processes, there is no alternative to the current methods as of yet. But still, let's not let better be the enemy of the perfect. And we should pursue that with great vigor.